Here is a story about how life presented an unpleasant surprise to me through my relationships. My wife turned out to be similar to the character of an indecent joke about a cuckold husband who unexpectedly returned home. A few years ago, I laughed at such stories among colleagues, unaware that I would become a living example in my youth. I was confident that such situations only happened to losers, however. I chose to marry a woman who had already been divorced and had a child. Since then, I cannot understand why I made such a decision. Externally, I was considered a successful and self-assured guy, and financial troubles were not foreign to me. Nevertheless, I suddenly found myself in family difficulties. I met Irina, my future wife, at a relative's anniversary. At the beginning of our acquaintance, there were no serious plans regarding her, and she immediately confessed that she had just divorced and devoted herself entirely to her 1-year-old son. At that time, she claimed to have no time for love, however. Our acquaintance developed, and at some point, Ira began to show interest in me. We bumped into each other accidentally in stores, in the park, and finally, I decided to approach her more actively. Initially, she did not show much desire to build romantic relationships, but gradually, everything changed. Urka increasingly came to me, asking her mom to stay with the child, and thus we gradually became closer. Everything culminated in a trip to the registry office, and I became her husband and father, but, alas, my life turned out to be not a fairy tale but more like an ironic twist of the plot. Here is the story of how my wife's ex-husband intervened in our family life. Although we didn't have our own children and I wasn't yet the official father, he suddenly appeared on the scene. This man, who cheated on her and elicited intense hatred, showed up one evening under our house and began talking to my wife. When she returned, she was in tears. According to her, Vasia demanded that she let the child go with him. One suggested a simple solution: to let him have some time with the child. However, I also decided to take a rational approach and discuss the legal side of the matter. My wife cried and screamed that she couldn't bear to see her ex-husband. I tried to calm her down and proposed finding compromises. A few days later, Vasia returned, demanding time with the child. This time it happened on my day off when I had already had a beer, and an unpleasant scene unfolded. I drove him out of the entrance, thus. By the time Irina decided to allocate a parental day for Vasia, an antipathy had already formed between us. I even suggested he come on the days when I wasn't at home to avoid conflicts. After the introduction of the parental days, Irina often found herself in a bad mood. She said she couldn't forgive Vasia, but at the same time acknowledged that he was a good father. I wasn't particularly interested in the details of his visits due to my dislike for this person. However, 6 months after the introduction of parental days, a neighbor dropped a comment, pointing to my day off. Your work schedule can be learned when there's a taxi under our building. It seemed that Vasia, my wife's ex-husband, had his own plans. He worked as a taxi driver, and the hints of his presence under the windows of our house were evident, but, for some reason, I didn't immediately grasp the full extent of the situation. I thought it was just coincidences, because I knew he usually showed up on the days when I left for a day. However, I should have asked myself why the neighbor sees a taxi under our building in the dark hours. But, it seems, I missed that moment. At some point, Senya, my child, mentioned that Dad put him to bed yesterday. I asked Irina why Vasia, the ex-husband, stayed with us until night. She answered with some dissatisfaction, claiming that he sometimes had to indicate even the timing. But the resolution occurred exactly as in the joke. I left for a day. However, in the evening, an unexpected situation arose, and work in our workshop was halted. Everyone was sent home, and, naturally, my wife was unaware of this, but I didn't inform her about my unexpected return. I arrive at the door around 11 p.m., insert the key into the lock, but can't open it. The door is locked from the inside. I start calling cautiously not to wake up Senya. At some point, I hear a rustle behind the door, which infuriated me. I knock, call on my wife's phone, and then even try to break down the door. Behind the door, Senya starts crying. And when my wife opens it, she has no expression on her face. She can't explain anything, and I go searching through the rooms. In the kitchen, under the table, I find Vasya hunched over. When I order him to come out, I hear my voice, but I don't recognize it. Vasya whimpers, but doesn't come out. In response to the question hit, I get the answer, of course I will, but I promise not to maim. Vasily never came out, and I had to pull him out. Irina tried to hold me back. The child was screaming. Neighbors gathered, and the cuckold joke was recreated in real life. Later, when I kicked Vasya and my wife with the child out the door, the neighbor opened my eyes to the whole situation. It turns out that Vasya, my wife's ex-husband, constantly visited her during the day, right after I left for a day and left the next morning. The neighbor had long noticed this but hesitated to tell me directly. The former spouses spent time with their little one, walking, having lunch and dinner together. After that, they put their son to sleep and went to bed themselves. In the end, Irina created her own family for one day a week. In conclusion, I can say that my relationship with a divorced woman with a child turned out to be a big mistake. Friends and family warned me that getting into complicated relationships with someone else's child would be unwise. They saw the danger in the fact that the child was not mine, and that a divorced woman could have her flaws as confirmed by the failure of her first marriage. However, no one warned me that the danger could lie in infidelity, and not just with someone but with her first husband. When Irina was packing her things, she had to admit that, essentially, she didn't cheat on me, as she had slept with him even before us. So, think, men. When entering into a relationship with a woman who already has a child from a previous marriage. In my case, it became a lesson for me.